In a world saturated with headlines and endless analysis of the conflict raging in the heart of the Middle East, have you ever paused to consider that the true story, the deepest root of it all, was not written in the newspapers of today, but in the sacred scrolls of millennia past? We are told this is a conflict over land, a political struggle, a clash of nationalisms. But what if it's something more? What if the destiny of the land called Palestine and the city of Jerusalem is a story that God Himself began writing long before any of our modern nations even existed? Today we will journey beyond the noise of the news cycle and into the heart of prophecy. We will uncover a truth that few understand, a truth about the very name of the land, the scattering of a people, and their miraculous return, all foretold in the pages of the Bible. This is not a political commentary. This is a spiritual excavation to understand the divine plan unfolding before our very eyes. Let us begin with a simple but profound question. Where did the name Palestine come from? Many believe it to be an ancient, indigenous name for the land, but history and scripture tell a very different story. The name was a deliberate invention, a tool of psychological warfare wielded by the Roman Empire. To understand its origin, we must first remember who the Philistines were. In the Bible, they are the perennial enemies of Israel. They were the people of Goliath, the coastal power that constantly warred against Samson, Saul, and David. They were the other, the uncircumcised, a thorn in the side of God's chosen people. The name Palestine is the Latin derivative of Philistia, the land of the Philistines. The name itself was a weapon, designed to sever a people from their heritage. But why would Rome do this? The answer lies in the fierce, unyielding spirit of the Jewish people, and a rebellion that would shake the empire to its core. After the catastrophic destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple in 70 AD by the Roman general Titus, one might have expected the Jewish spirit to be broken forever. But it was not. Decades later, a fire of rebellion was kindled once more. Around the year 132 AD, a charismatic and powerful leader named Simon Bar Kokhba rose up, leading a final, desperate revolt against the might of Rome. For a brief time, he was hailed by many as the Messiah, a military and spiritual leader who would restore Israel's sovereignty. The Bar Kokhba revolt was astonishingly successful at first, re-establishing an independent Jewish state for over 2 years. But the fury of the Roman Empire, now under the rule of Emperor Hadrian, was absolute. Hadrian dispatched his best legions to crush the uprising. The war that followed was not merely a suppression, it was a campaign of annihilation. Roman historians tell of immense devastation, of hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives lost, and countless towns and villages razed to the ground. The revolt was brutally and systematically extinguished. It was in the aftermath of this bloodshed that Emperor Hadrian unleashed his final and perhaps most insidious weapon. He understood that to truly defeat a people, you must not only break their bodies, but also erase their memory. He sought to sever the eternal bond between the Jewish people and their ancestral homeland. His first act was to rename the land. The province of Judea, the heartland of the Jewish people for over 1,000 years, was officially renamed Syria Palestina. It was a calculated, venomous insult. He was marking God's holy land with the name of Israel's ancient enemies, the Philistines. It was a declaration to the world. This land no longer belongs to the people of Judah. It belongs to the memory of their foes. But Hadrian did not stop there. He rebuilt Jerusalem as a pagan Roman city, naming it Aelia Capitolina in honor of his own family name, and the chief Roman god, Jupiter Capitolinus. And in the ultimate act of desecration, upon the Temple Mount, the very site where the Holy of Holies once stood, he erected a temple to Jupiter. He forbade any Jew from even setting foot inside the city on pain of death. The goal was clear: to wipe the identity of Israel, the memory of Jerusalem, and the name of their God from the face of the earth. From this crucible of suffering, the great diaspora, the scattering, began in earnest. The surviving Jewish people were driven from their land, dispersed to the four corners of the earth as slaves, exiles, and refugees. For nearly 2,000 years they would wander among the nations, often persecuted, always outsiders. It was a period of immense darkness and sorrow. Yet, woven into the very fabric of their identity, carried in the scrolls they protected with their lives, was a promise that defied the power of the Roman Empire and the passage of time. It was an unbreakable, divine promise of return. The Lord had spoken through Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, saying that even if his people were cast to the uttermost parts of heaven, from there he would gather them and bring them back into the land which their fathers possessed. The prophet Jeremiah echoed this hope, declaring God's word, "I will be found by you, and I will gather you from all the nations and all the places where I have driven you, and I will bring you back to the place from which I sent you into exile." This was not just a wishful dream. It was a divine appointment, a prophetic certainty that sustained a people through centuries of wandering. They held on to the belief that one day, God would reverse the curse of Hadrian and call his people home. And so began the longest, darkest night in the history of a people. For 18 centuries, the Jewish people lived as tenants in the lands of others. They were a nation without a state, a people without a geography they could call their own. Think about what that means. Your identity, your laws, your culture, your very existence is preserved not by borders and armies, but by memory and by faith. Without the temple in Jerusalem, the central pillar of their worship was gone. The sacrificial system, which had been the heart of their covenant relationship with God for a millennium, had ceased. How could a faith so tied to a specific place and a specific building survive? The answer is a testament to their resilience and to the divine wisdom embedded in their scriptures. In the absence of the temple, the Word of God itself became their sanctuary. The synagogue, the house of study and prayer, replaced the temple as the center of community life. The priest, whose role was tied to the physical altar, gave way to the rabbi, the teacher, whose authority came from his mastery of the Torah. This was a profound and necessary transformation. Judaism became a portable homeland. They carried their identity in their scrolls, in their traditions, and in their hearts. The meticulous study of the Talmud, the vast collection of rabbinic law and lore, created a framework for living a holy life, a, quote, Judea in exile. No matter where they found themselves, they built a hedge around the Torah, preserving the core of their faith while adapting to life in Babylon, in Persia, in Spain, and in Poland. But this existence was always precarious. They were a people living on a knife's edge. In Christian Europe, they were often branded as the, quote, Christ killers, a people cursed and condemned, forced to live in segregated ghettos, wear identifying badges, and barred from owning land or joining guilds. In the Muslim world, they were tolerated as galom, second-class citizens who had to pay a special tax for the privilege of practicing their ancestral faith. Their history in the diaspora is a painful litany of expulsions and massacres. In 1096, the First Crusade began not with a battle in the Holy Land, but with the slaughter of entire Jewish communities along the Rhine. In 1290, they were expelled from England. In 1394, from France. The most infamous was the expulsion from Spain in 1492, where a vibrant, centuries-old community was given a horrifying choice: convert to Catholicism, leave or die. Through all this, the longing for Zion, for Jerusalem, never faded. It was not a vague, sentimental nostalgia. It was the central, driving force of their spiritual lives. 3 times a day in their prayers, they turned to face the direction of Jerusalem, pleading with God to rebuild Jerusalem, the holy city, speedily in our days. At the end of the Passover Seder, the feast celebrating their liberation from Egypt, they would conclude with the same hopeful, defiant declaration: next year in Jerusalem. At a wedding, the most joyous of occasions, the groom would crush a glass under his foot, a stark, poignant reminder that no joy could be complete as long as the temple lay in ruins and the people were in exile. This memory was woven into the fabric of their daily existence. It was their compass, their true north, a constant reminder that no matter how comfortable they might become in London, Amsterdam, or New York, they were not yet home. This was a temporary sojourn. Their true destiny lay back in the land of their fathers, the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the land Hadrian had tried and failed to erase from their memory. And for centuries, this was the state of affairs: a people scattered, often persecuted, held together by a shared memory and a fervent, daily prayer for return. But then, a new light seemed to dawn over Europe. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, began to challenge the old religious dogmas and feudal structures. In its wake came the promise of emancipation. Starting with the French Revolution in 1789, the walls of the ghettos, both physical and legal, began to come down. Jews were offered citizenship, rights, a place at the table of the modern nation-state. This was a profound seismic shift. For the first time in millennia, an alternative to the dream of Zion presented itself: assimilation. The new idea was that one could be a German, a Frenchman, or a Briton asterisk of the Mosaic persuasion. You could be a loyal citizen of your country, contribute to its culture and economy, and practice your ancestral faith in the privacy of your home and synagogue. Why dream of a dusty, distant outpost in the Ottoman Empire when you could write symphonies in Vienna, practice law in Berlin, or build fortunes in London? Many embraced this promise with open arms. They shed their distinctive dress, shaved their beards, and eagerly adopted the language and customs of their host nations. It seemed like the long winter of exile was finally over, not by a miraculous return to Jerusalem, but by being welcomed into the family of nations. But this new dawn had a dark, menacing shadow. The old hatred did not simply vanish with the coming of reason. It mutated. The medieval, religious anti-Judaism that condemned Jews for rejecting Christ evolved into a modern, political, and pseudo-scientific anti-Semitism. This new poison was even more insidious. It wasn't about what Jews believed, it was about what they supposedly were. Drawing on twisted theories of race and social Darwinism, anti-Semites claimed that Jews were an alien, unassimilable race, a foreign body within the nation. They were portrayed not as religious dissenters, but as a conspiratorial force controlling finance, the press, and politics for their own nefarious ends. Suddenly, the very success of assimilated Jews was used as evidence against them. Their patriotism was questioned, their loyalty deemed suspect. Conversion to Christianity, the traditional escape hatch from persecution, was no longer enough. If Jewishness was in your blood, then you were a Jew forever, and forever a threat. This racial anti-Semitism provided a convenient scapegoat for all the anxieties of the modern age: industrialization, economic upheaval, and political instability. No event exposed the lie of emancipation more brutally than the Dreyfus affair in France at the very end of the 19th century. France was supposed to be the beacon of liberty, the birthplace of the rights of man. Captain Alfred Dreyfus was the perfect example of the assimilated Jew, a fiercely patriotic Alsatian, a devoted officer in the French army, a man who saw himself as French in every conceivable way. In 1894, he was falsely accused of selling military secrets to Germany. The evidence was flimsy, a forged document, but it didn't matter. He was a Jew, and that was enough. He was subjected to a sham trial, convicted of treason, and publicly humiliated in a horrifying ceremony in Paris. His sword was broken, his insignia ripped from his uniform, as a mob roared, "Death to the Jews! Death to Judas!" This was not a medieval peasant rabble. This was the civilized public of modern Paris, the heart of enlightened Europe. Dreyfus was shipped off to a living hell on Devil's Island, and for years the French establishment, from the military to the church, colluded to cover up the truth and protect the real traitor, a non-Jewish officer. Watching this spectacle unfold was a Viennese journalist and playwright named Theodor Herzl. Like Dreyfus, Herzl was a thoroughly assimilated secular Jew. He spoke German, not Yiddish. He admired German culture and believed that the Jewish question could be solved through education and assimilation. But the Dreyfus affair shattered his worldview. He stood in that Parisian crowd and heard the chants of "Death to the Jews!" And he had a terrifying epiphany. He realized that it didn't matter how patriotic a Jew was, how much he contributed to society, how little he practiced his religion. In a crisis, for the mob, for the establishment, he would always be the outsider, the traitor, the Jew. The hatred was a deep, irrational force that assimilation could not cure. He concluded that as long as the Jews were a minority everywhere, they would be a scapegoat everywhere. The problem wasn't that Jews weren't enlightened enough. The problem was that they were homeless. The only rational answer, he decided, was not to try harder to fit in, but to leave. The age-old prayer, "Next year in Jerusalem," had to be transformed from a religious hope into a concrete political program. The Jewish people, he argued in his seminal 1896 pamphlet, not Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, needed to secure a homeland of their own, recognized under public law, where they could finally be masters of their own destiny. This was a revolutionary, even scandalous idea to many. Remember the context. For the wealthy assimilated Jews of Vienna, Berlin, or London, this was deeply unsettling. They had spent a century trying to prove they were loyal Germans, Frenchmen, or Englishmen who just happened to practice a different religion. They had shed their ghetto ways, embraced European culture, and were succeeding in business, the arts, and the sciences. Herzl's proposal seemed like a capitulation to the anti-Semites. It was as if he was agreeing with their core accusation that Jews were an alien nation, incapable of true loyalty to their home countries. To them, Zionism was a dangerous, backward-looking fantasy that threatened to undo all their progress and legitimize the very prejudice they were fighting. On the other end of the spectrum, many of the deeply religious Jews, particularly in Eastern Europe, also rejected Herzl's vision, but for entirely different reasons. For them, the return to Zion was a sacred, messianic promise. It was something God would bring about in his own time, with the arrival of the Messiah. For a secular, non-observant, German-speaking intellectual like Herzl to propose organizing this return through political congresses, diplomatic negotiations, and chartered companies, well, to many rabbis, this was heresy. It was seen as an arrogant human attempt to force God's hand, a rebellion against the divine plan. So you have this fascinating paradox. Herzl was seen as too Jewish by the assimilated and not nearly Jewish enough by the religious. But Herzl's message resonated powerfully with a third group, the millions of Yiddish-speaking Jews trapped in the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire. These were not people debating philosophical questions in comfortable Viennese coffeehouses. They were facing state-sponsored violence, crushing poverty, and systemic discrimination. The pogroms that had erupted in the 1880s following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II were a brutal reality. For them, assimilation was not an option, it was a cruel joke. The Enlightenment had never reached their SHTETLS. When they heard Herzl's call, they didn't hear a threat to their status or a theological transgression. They heard a promise of liberation. They heard a practical modern answer to an ancient and unbearable suffering. They heard the possibility of living as free people on their own soil, no longer at the mercy of a hostile czar or a violent mob. It was this mass of desperate, dispossessed Eastern European Jewry that would become the engine of the Zionist movement. Herzl, however, was not just a theorist, he was a man of incredible energy and charisma. He understood that an idea in a pamphlet is just ink on paper. To make it real, you need an organization, a platform, a political body. And so, in August of 1897, he convened the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. This event cannot be overstated. It was, in essence, the founding assembly of a state in waiting. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Jews from Russia, Germany, Poland, France, England, and even Palestine came together not as a scattered religious community, but as a unified national delegation. They came dressed in formal attire, top hats and tailcoats, to signal to the world, and to themselves, the seriousness of their purpose. This was not a prayer meeting, this was a parliament. They established the World Zionist Organization. They adopted a program, the Basel Program, which stated clearly that Zionism seeks to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine secured under public law. They debated structures for fundraising, diplomacy, and settlement. It was the moment a vague, ancient yearning was forged into a concrete, modern political movement. After the Congress, Herzl famously wrote in his diary, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, and certainly in 50, everyone will know it." A remarkably prescient statement. He understood that he had created the political and psychological infrastructure of sovereignty, even if the land and the charter were not yet secured. But a political infrastructure without territory is a government in exile, and a psychological infrastructure without a home is a recipe for perpetual frustration. Herzl knew this better than anyone. The Basel Program wasn't just a declaration, it was a plan of action. The next step was diplomacy. Herzl, the journalist and playwright, transformed himself into Herzl, the international statesman without a state. His energy was astounding. He crisscrossed Europe, seeking a charter for Jewish settlement in Palestine from the great powers of the day. His primary target was the Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II, as Palestine was, after all, part of the Ottoman Empire. Herzl envisioned a deal. The Jews, with their international financial connections, would help the deeply indebted Ottoman Empire sort out its finances. In return, the Sultan would grant a charter for an autonomous Jewish settlement in Palestine. It was a grand, almost audacious plan. Here was a private citizen representing a scattered people, attempting to negotiate with the ruler of a vast empire. He managed to get audiences, which was a feat in itself. He met with the German Kaiser, hoping he would intercede with the Sultan. But the Sultan, while polite, was unmoved. He was willing to allow Jews to settle anywhere else in his empire, but not as a concentrated autonomous group in Palestine. He understood, perhaps better than some European leaders, the potential implications of planting a new national entity in that sensitive region. The answer was a firm no. This diplomatic brick wall was a huge setback. While Herzl was meeting with emperors and ministers, the situation for the Jews he sought to save was growing more dire. In 1903, a horrific pogrom erupted in Kishinev in the Russian Empire. Dozens of Jews were murdered, hundreds wounded, and their property systematically destroyed over 2 days of rioting, with the authorities doing little to intervene. The Kishinev pogrom sent a shockwave of terror and despair throughout the Jewish world. It was a brutal reminder that the clock was ticking. The need for a safe haven was not an abstract ideological point. It was a matter of life and death. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that the British government made an unexpected offer. The colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, proposed a territory for autonomous Jewish settlement in a part of British East Africa, what is today Kenya. This became known as the Uganda Scheme. For Herzl the pragmatist, this was a potential lifeline. He saw it not as a replacement for Zion, but as a temporary Noctisul, a night asylum. A place to shelter his people from the storm while they continued to work towards the ultimate goal of Palestine. He believed that saving lives now was the most important priority. He decided to bring the proposal to the Sixth Zionist Congress in 1903. What followed was one of the most passionate and painful debates in the history of the movement. It nearly tore the organization apart. When Herzl presented the plan, the hall erupted. The delegates from Eastern Europe, particularly the Russians who had just witnessed the horror of Kishinev firsthand, were aghast. They saw it as a betrayal of the 2,000-year-old dream of returning to Zion. For them, Zionism without Zion was meaningless. One delegate famously cried out, "If you are not for Zion, you are a traitor." They accused Herzl of abandoning the very soul of the movement for a temporary, practical solution. The Russian delegation, the heart and soul of the movement's popular support, walked out in protest, weeping openly in the corridors. This wasn't a political disagreement, it was a spiritual crisis. The debate laid bare the central tension within Zionism. Was it primarily a modern nationalist project to solve a political problem, the Jewish question, or was it the fulfillment of an ancient, quasi-messianic promise intrinsically linked to a specific piece of land? Herzl, the Western assimilated Jew, saw the immediate, practical need. The Eastern European Jews, the Zionai Zion, or Zionists of Zion, saw an unbreakable, sacred bond. They would not trade Jerusalem for a patch of land in Africa, no matter how desperate their situation. The vote on whether to even send an investigatory commission to East Africa was incredibly close and deeply divisive. It passed, but the victory felt hollow. Herzl was shaken. He had brought this proposal forward out of a deep sense of responsibility, a desperate attempt to save lives, and he was now being branded a traitor by the very people he sought to rescue. He had to personally plead with the Russian delegates, promising them his undying loyalty to the land of Israel, to get them to return to the Congress. The emotional toll on him was immense. Ultimately, the Uganda scheme was rejected at the next Congress in 1905, after Herzl's death. But the crisis it provoked was a defining moment. It proved, once and for all, that for the vast majority of his followers, the Zionist project was inextricably and non-negotiably tied to Palestine. There was no plan B. The movement had stared into the abyss of a schism and had chosen unity, but a unity defined by an unwavering focus on one specific place. The episode also tragically weakened Herzl, whose health was already failing under the immense strain of his work. He had built a global political movement from scratch, but he was learning that he could not always control the powerful emotions and deep-seated beliefs he had unleashed. The rift created by the Uganda proposal didn't simply heal after the Congress. It led to a formal, albeit temporary, schism. The most prominent figure to break away was the British writer Israel Zangwill. Zangwill was a brilliant, sharp-tongued intellectual, and initially a close collaborator of Herzl's. He saw the logic in Herzl's pragmatism. For Zangwill, the primary goal was to save Jewish lives, to provide a, quote, land without a people for a people without a land, a phrase he famously and controversially coined. The specific location was secondary to the urgency of the need. After the Uganda scheme was officially buried, Zangwill felt the Zionist organization had chosen sentiment over survival. So in 1905, he founded the Jewish Territorialist Organization, or JTO. Its mission was simple and stark: to find and secure any suitable territory anywhere in the world for Jewish settlement. They explored options from Angola to Argentina to Canada. The JTO represented the logical conclusion of Herzl's most pragmatic, desperate thinking, detached from the spiritual and historical pull of Eretz Israel. For a time, it presented a genuine alternative to mainstream Zionism. On the other side, the Zionist Zion faction became more organized and resolute than ever. They were led by figures like Menachem Ushishkin, a powerful and uncompromising Russian Zionist leader. Ushishkin was everything Herzl was not. Deeply rooted in Eastern European Jewish tradition, fluent in Hebrew, and absolutely unyielding on the centrality of Palestine. During the Sixth Congress, he had been in Palestine itself, and he returned to Europe to lead the charge against the Uganda proposal. For Ushishkin and his followers, Zionism was not a refugee project. It was a project of national rebirth in the ancestral homeland. Full stop. The idea of diverting funds, energy, and political capital to investigate a location in Africa was, to them, a dangerous and blasphemous distraction. The victory against the Uganda scheme was their victory. It cemented their ideological dominance within the movement and ensured that, going forward, the World Zionist Organization's resources would be focused solely on one goal: Palestine. So, you see, the Uganda crisis, as painful as it was, served a crucial, clarifying purpose. It forced the movement to have an argument with itself, to define its own soul, and in the end, the soul of the movement proved to be inextricably bound to the soil of a particular land. It demonstrated that Zionism was not merely a modern, secular nationalism that could be transplanted anywhere. It was fueled by a 2,000-year-old memory, by a religious and cultural longing that was geographically specific. This realization paradoxically strengthened the movement. The ambiguity was gone. The internal debate was settled. From that point on, anyone dealing with the Zionist organization knew exactly what they wanted. There were no more side projects or alternative locations on the table. It was Palestine or nothing. This clarity came at a tremendous personal cost to Herzl. He died in 1904, less than a year after that tumultuous Sixth Congress. He was only 44 years old. His doctors cited heart failure, but everyone who knew him understood he had worked himself to death. He had poured every ounce of his energy, his fortune, and his health into this cause. The emotional strain of the Uganda debate, of being called a traitor by the very people he was trying to save, was the final blow. He died before seeing his dream realized, and before the movement he created had fully healed the wounds he had inadvertently inflicted upon it. His final words were reportedly, "Give my greetings to Palestine. I gave my heart's blood for my people." Herzl's death marked the end of an era. The era of what we call political Zionism. His entire strategy was top-down. He believed that the Jewish state would be created through a charter, a grand political agreement granted by one of the great powers, like the Ottoman Sultan or the German Kaiser. He focused on high-level diplomacy, on meeting with kings, ministers, and financiers. But with Herzl gone, the movement began to shift. A new generation of leaders, many of them from the Zionist Zion camp, came to the fore. They championed a different approach, what became known as practical Zionism. Their leader was Chaim Weizmann, a Russian-born chemist who would later become the first president of Israel. The practical Zionists argued that waiting for a political charter was not enough. They believed that a Jewish state had to be built from the ground up, fact by fact, acre by acre, person by person. Their focus was not on the royal courts of Europe, but on the rocky hills of Judea and the swampy valleys of the Galilee. They advocated for continued immigration, the Aliyah, and the painstaking work of land purchase, agricultural settlement, and the revival of the Hebrew language. This was the philosophy that would drive the second Aliyah, a wave of immigration that began around 1904, composed of young, idealistic, and often socialist pioneers from the Russian Empire. These weren't the gentleman farmers of the first Aliyah. These were revolutionaries fleeing the pogroms and the failed Russian Revolution of 1905, determined to create a new type of Jew and a new type of society. They were the ones who would establish the first kibbutz, Degania, in 1909. They were the ones who would lay the foundations for the city of Tel Aviv on the sand dunes north of Jaffa in that same year. They believed that national rights would not be granted from on high, but would be earned through labor, through conquest of the land. Not by force of arms, but by the plow. This shift from Herzl's diplomatic Zionism to the grassroots, settlement-oriented practical Zionism was profound. It meant the center of gravity of the movement was no longer in Vienna or Basel, but increasingly in Palestine itself, in the dusty, malaria-ridden settlements where a new reality was being forged. The movement had lost its prophet, but it was gaining its pioneers. And it was these pioneers, with their calloused hands and unwavering ideology, who would begin to create the facts on the ground that would, decades later, make a political charter not just a dream but an inevitability. And so, the dream of a state transitioned from the gilded halls of European diplomacy to the sun-baked soil of Palestine, carried not by a prophet's charter but by the pioneers, plows. This profound shift from political theory to practical reality leaves us with a critical question, and I want to know what you think in the comments below. Which is ultimately more powerful in forging a nation? The grand vision of a single leader, or the collective on-the-ground labor of thousands? If you're fascinated by how these ideas shape our world, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because you won't want to miss our next video, where we explore the birth of the kibbutz and the creation of Tel Aviv. Until then, stay curious. This is Marco, signing off.